the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel of water barely 33 miles wide at its tightest point, nestled between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through this stretch of sea. Tankers loaded with crude oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq all funnel through this bottleneck before reaching the rest of the world. Whoever controls this strait controls the heartbeat of the global economy, and Iran knows it. What began as a series of shadowy maritime incidents quietly escalated into one of the most dangerous naval confrontations the Persian Gulf had seen in decades. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval units, operating fast attack craft and armed drones, began harassing commercial vessels moving through international waters. At first, the world watched cautiously. Shipping companies rerouted, insurance premiums spiked, oil markets trembled. But then Iran crossed a line that could not be ignored. In a series of coordinated operations, Iranian forces moved to seize and disable foreign-flagged commercial tankers operating in the Strait of Hormuz. Armed IRGC speedboats swarmed cargo vessels, cutting off their communications, firing warning shots, and in several cases, boarding the ships by force. Helicopters dropped masked commandos directly onto the decks of moving tankers. These were not random acts of piracy. This was a calculated, strategic message delivered in the language of military force. Iran was telling the world that if it faced further economic pressure, if new sanctions tightened, if diplomatic negotiations failed, it had the power to hold the global oil supply hostage. But this is where things become more dangerous. The tankers being targeted were not just any vessels. Several carried cargo bound for American allies in Europe and Asia. One was flagged under a nation with direct ties to a NATO member state. Suddenly, this was no longer just a regional dispute between Iran and its Gulf Arab neighbors. This was a direct provocation aimed at the United States and the broader Western alliance. The Pentagon watched the situation deteriorate in real time from the 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama, Bahrain, just a few hundred miles from where Iranian commandos were rappelling onto the decks of civilian ships. Washington's initial response was measured but unmistakable. The U.S. Navy immediately surged additional warships into the region. The aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, already operating in the broader Middle East theater, was repositioned closer to the Gulf. Destroyers armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles and advanced air defense systems took up positions near the strait. American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft began flying continuous surveillance missions, feeding real-time intelligence to commanders on the ground and at sea. The message from the Pentagon was clear. The United States was watching, and it was ready. But Iran did not blink. Instead, the IRGC escalated. Iranian forces deployed what military analysts had long feared, a combination of anti-ship ballistic missiles, fast attack swarm tactics, and a dense network of sea mines quietly seated across key shipping lanes. Iran had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of asymmetric naval confrontation. Its strategy, sometimes referred to as a mosaic defense, relied not on matching American firepower ship for ship, but on overwhelming U.S. naval forces with sheer volume, hundreds of small, fast boats, swarms of armed drones, missiles fired from hardened coastal batteries buried deep into mountainous terrain. Iran's military doctrine was built around one central idea: make the cost of any American military response unbearably high. Then came the moment that changed everything. An American-flagged naval auxiliary vessel operating in support of 5th Fleet operations was struck by what investigators quickly identified as an Iranian anti-ship drone. The drone, believed to be a variant of the Iranian-designed Shahed series, had flown low and slow, evading radar detection before slamming into the ship's hull. Casualties were reported. American blood had been spilled in international waters by an Iranian weapons system. For the White House, this was no longer a crisis to be managed from a distance. This was an act of war. The U.S. military response, when it came, was overwhelming in its precision and absolutely devastating in its effect. It began not with a single strike, but with a coordinated multi-domain campaign designed to systematically dismantle Iran's ability to threaten maritime traffic. The operation was swift, surgical, and brutal. In the opening hours, U.S. Navy destroyers and submarines launched a coordinated salvo of Tomahawk land attack missiles targeting the IRGC naval bases along Iran's southern coastline. The port of Bandar Abbas, Iran's most strategically critical naval facility and home to its fast attack fleet, was struck repeatedly. Fuel depots exploded, dry docks were destroyed. The fast boats that had terrorized commercial shipping for weeks were reduced to burning wreckage in their pens. Simultaneously, American B-2 stealth bombers flying from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean dropped precision-guided munitions on coastal radar installations and anti-ship missile batteries embedded in the Zagros mountain range. These were the eyes and teeth of Iran's maritime defense network. Within hours, they had been blinded and defanged, but this is where the operation became truly extraordinary. American electronic warfare assets, including the EA-18G Growler aircraft launched from the Carrier Strike Group, flooded Iranian military communication frequencies with targeted jamming. Iranian commanders found themselves unable to coordinate. Orders could not be transmitted. The carefully rehearsed mosaic defense that Iran had built over decades began to fracture in real time. Meanwhile, U.S. Cyber Command executed offensive cyber operations against the IRGC's naval command and control infrastructure, corrupting targeting data and disabling automated weapon systems before they could be brought to bear. The United States had not just struck Iran, it had reached inside its military nervous system and shut it down. Navy SEAL teams and Marine raiders inserted covertly from submarines offshore conducted targeted raids on 2 IRGC speedboat staging areas on remote islands in the Gulf. The raids were fast and precise. Intelligence gathered during these operations provided critical data on Iran's mine-laying patterns, allowing U.S. Navy mine countermeasures vessels and MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters to begin immediate sweeping operations across the affected shipping lanes. Within 72 hours of the opening strike, the first commercial tankers were moving through the strait under heavy U.S. naval escort. But the consequences of what had just happened stretched far beyond the Persian Gulf. In Beijing, Chinese military officials convened emergency meetings. China is Iran's single largest oil customer, and any prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be catastrophic for the Chinese economy, which was already grappling with slowing growth. Beijing had long maintained a delicate balancing act, supporting Iran diplomatically and economically while avoiding direct military confrontation with the United States. Now, Chinese naval vessels operating in the broader Indian Ocean region were being watched extremely closely by American surveillance assets. Beijing dispatched a naval task force toward the Gulf of Oman, officially described as a routine exercise, but positioned in a way that made its strategic message unmistakable. China was not going to allow the United States to reshape the security architecture of the Persian Gulf without making its own presence felt. Moscow's response was characteristically calculated. Russia had its own interests in regional instability. Higher oil prices, driven by fear and disruption in the Gulf, directly benefited the Russian federal budget. Russian state media portrayed the American strikes as unprovoked aggression against a sovereign nation. Behind the scenes, Russian military intelligence was almost certainly feeding data to their Iranian counterparts, helping Tehran understand the gaps in its air defense coverage that American missiles had exploited. The Russia-Iran axis, already deepened by shared weapons transfers during the conflict in Ukraine, grew more visible and more dangerous. NATO found itself in a difficult position. European member states, dependent on Gulf energy supplies that flowed through the Strait of Hormuz and onward to European shores, broadly supported the American operation in private while struggling to endorse it publicly. France and the United Kingdom quietly moved naval assets into the region. Germany called for de-escalation, while simultaneously accelerating conversations about strategic energy diversification. The alliance was united in its concern but fractured in its appetite for open confrontation with Iran. And then came Iran's countermove, one that nobody had anticipated. Rather than attempting to reopen direct military confrontation with the American carrier strike group, Iranian leaders turned to their network of proxy forces across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon placed Israeli northern communities under a sustained barrage of precision rockets. Houthi forces in Yemen launched a wave of ballistic missile and drone attacks against Saudi oil infrastructure, striking a major processing facility and temporarily knocking out a significant portion of Saudi export capacity. Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq simultaneously launched drone and rocket attacks against American military installations at Al-Assad Air Base and the Ain al-Assad complex, wounding American personnel and forcing temporary evacuation of non-essential staff. Iran's message was unmistakable. You may have destroyed our boats and burned our bases, but we have 1,000 hands across the Middle East, and we will use every single one of them. The United States and its allies now faced the terrifying reality of a region-wide conflict burning simultaneously on multiple fronts. American military planners, already stretched by commitments in Europe and the Pacific, found themselves managing a complex, multi-theater crisis in the most volatile region on the planet. The strategic calculus had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a maritime security operation in a narrow waterway had metastasized into something far larger, far more dangerous, and far harder to contain. The Strait of Hormuz itself, though now technically open under American naval protection, remained deeply fragile. A single Iranian mine not yet found. A single drone not yet intercepted. A single mistake by an exhausted sailor or a frightened pilot. Any one of these could reignite the full cycle of escalation. Oil markets had already reacted violently. Crude prices surged to levels not seen since the peak of previous Gulf crises. Global shipping insurance had become nearly impossible to obtain for the region without government backing. The International Monetary Fund was quietly revising its global growth forecasts downward. The economic shockwaves were spreading from the Persian Gulf into every economy on Earth. This is what makes the Strait of Hormuz unlike any other choke point on the planet. Its vulnerability is not just a military problem, it is a civilizational one. What the world witnessed in these events was not simply a military confrontation between the United States and Iran. It was a preview of what modern asymmetric warfare looks like in the 21st century. It was Iran demonstrating that a smaller, regionally powerful nation can impose enormous costs on the world's most powerful military simply by threatening a narrow strip of water. And it was the United States demonstrating that when pushed far enough, its military response would be overwhelming, multi-domain, and ruthlessly efficient. But wars, once started, rarely end where they begin. The fires burning from Lebanon to Yemen, from the waters of the Persian Gulf to the hardened shelters of Iraqi militia groups, all trace back to that narrow channel between Iran and Arabia. As long as the world runs on oil, as long as global trade depends on that 33-mile stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz will remain what it has always been, the most dangerous piece of ocean on Earth. And whoever controls it controls everything.